Not to breathe on the microphone too much. My name is Levine. I'm a biologist. I actually spend most of my time behind a computer, so I don't do much. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So, I am a biologist, but I spend most of my time behind a computer. In the next 45 minutes or so, I hope to show you why this is the case. You may wonder what this talk has to do with security. It doesn't have much to do with security. It has got a lot to do with hacking. It has a bit to do with computers, but mostly it has to do with yourself. And with life in general. I want to address the fundamental question, why is there life and why is it the way it is? If you think about it, it's strange that we know more about the state of the universe a picosecond after the Big Bang than we know about this curious creature, a slime mold. Now I try to figure out how to hold this and this at the same time. Just a second. Great. One can always invoke one's deity of choice to explain the existence of life. I will skip over that type of explanation because it has been done quite a lot before. You can read about it elsewhere. I do have a belief that if God has created the world in 7 days, he would not have had much time for debugging, which explains many things, including this. I think I had a few of these in my tent this morning. Well, you could also ask your friendly neighborhood Darwinist, and he or she would probably say that's all due to evolution and natural selection, which of course still doesn't tell you why there are things to be selected in the first place. So then you can pick up a book on complexity, and it will tell you that it's all due to emergence and it's all very complex. And it will go on about butterflies causing thunderstorms and the way in which ants look for food, and in the end you still wouldn't know why we are here and how we got here. So, you could ask me, and I would say I don't know, but I have a nice story I can tell you, and it won't give you a full answer, but, well, still interesting. I'll start conveniently at the beginning, if I can find my mouse, which is the Big Bang, which doesn't really go bang, because there's no matter yet. It takes a few minutes for hydrogen and helium nuclei to form, and then about 300,000 years for atoms to form, and then a few billion years more to get small perturbations amplified and get galaxies. Well, and the first stars, and these can go supernova and produce the heavier elements that make up the more rocky and mushy bits of our solar system. And about 9 billion years after that, our sun and its planets have been formed from a large cloud of gas, as you can see here, I hope. Here we go. And there we have the solar system. Well, as we shall see, this energy from the sun is to become very important in sustaining life later on. But as far as we now believe, life actually originated not at the surface, but near the so-called volcanic vents we call black smokers these days. I'll skip this part. Yeah, these vents provide lots of building blocks for life and a lot of energy, especially in the form of high energy sulfide molecules. And fairly protected environment as well. So it's not that hard to imagine the appearance of the first metabolisms. So metabolisms are basically chains of reactions that are powered by breaking high energy molecules. And yeah, they can get coupled, and after a while you can get chains that start to replicate themselves. So they produce themselves from their constituents. We call these autocatalytic sets, and you could consider it to be the most basic form of life. Well, when you have a bunch of these self-reproducing chemical systems, you can get amplification, competition, natural selection, and they can get coupled, and well, basically they can get more complicated. Now, after a while, you probably had a few of these, different ones. Closer? Okay. You probably had a few of these, different ones of these, like RNA and DNA-based systems, and probably some other ones we don't know about because they went extinct. And after a while, you might have had that some of these systems became enclosed in lipid vesicles, and you can get the first cells. So the first ones were probably driven by chemical energy, but not very long afterwards you would have had evolution of systems that were capable of using sunlight. We call this photosynthesis. And these were actually, well, they sort of changed the planet because they're responsible for the oxygen atmosphere we have today. And they still power most of the processes that well, power everything in nature, almost everything, and a lot of human society. Okay, so, but it's a long way from the, from the first single-celled organisms to human society, of course. In fact, the first single-celled organisms didn't arrive until about 1.4 billion years ago. So the question is now, how do you go from a single cell to something like this, a wombat, or Richard Stallman? And the answer is not easy. But we're going to look at the basic ingredients of life and self-organization in general. And it turns out that self-organization is actually the easy part. This may seem a bit counterintuitive, because the second law of thermodynamics states that disorder always increases. And life is not actually, well, it's actually quite ordered. But that's only the case for closed systems. The Earth is an open system when it comes to energy. We receive lots of energy from the sun, and as long as this is the case, it won't reach thermodynamic equilibrium, and stuff will happen, basically. So what kind of stuff? Well, in the presence of large energy gradients like this, matter can start to organize itself. And what kind of organization? Well, you can get all kinds of structures that try to get rid of this gradient. Usually more or less circular flows of matter that try to transport the heat or dissipate it, as we say. And we call this convection. And it forms well, sort of hexagonal structures we call convection cells. So this is a basic example of what you call a dissipative structure. There's a structure formed to dissipate well, energy differences, basically. And it's one of the most basic examples of self-organization. Ah, there's an animation which doesn't work like it should. These are, well, the convection cells forming. Okay. Now, instead of being dissipated by convection, solar or geothermal energy can also be dissipated along other routes. For instance, it can be stored in chemical bonds and then be slowly dissipated through a series of exothermic reactions, which is not coincidentally exactly what happens in living systems. So you could see life as a very large and complicated set of chemical reactions that dissipate solar energy into heat. Okay, the opposite of this order is, of course, order. And that's why information is sometimes called negative entropy or negentropy. And an energy gradient, for example, or an energy potential for it's it's an ordered state. It has a low side and it has a high side, and it therefore contains information. And this, as this gradient is dissipated, the information is slowly lost. But because coupled chemical reactions can transfer free energy, the thermodynamic information can be temporarily converted into all kinds of other kinds of information. And this is the principal driving force behind the formation of complex structures and processes. It implies that structures and complexity can arise as long as there is energy input, because, well, without energy you would eventually end up here, and, well, the structure would more or less disappear. It's basically what happens when you power down your computer, or if you stop eating for a few weeks. So, well, looking at it this way, living systems are basically just very complicated cycles of matter. And they're driven by the huge energy gradient that's provided by the sun. And the matter is constantly being recycled and is temporarily stored in, well, mostly living systems and a lot of non-living systems as well. So thermodynamically speaking, it's not that strange we have life and complex structures. But energy is essential. There are also a number of other processes that shape the patterns we see. And probably the most important of this is feedback, especially positive feedback. As most of you will know, positive feedback is when a process has a positive influence on itself, so that it keeps amplifying itself. And this way it can amplify small random differences, for instance. And, well, it's responsible for anything from formation of galaxies to natural selection. And just as positive feedback is useful for amplification, negative feedback is useful for stopping things from getting out of hand. Well, negative feedback is, of course, when a process has a negative influence on itself, and then it slows down or it stops. Well, feedback processes seem to occur quite naturally in nature, and therefore quite frequently, and they're responsible for a lot of the non-linearity we see in nature. And it turns out the combination of positive and negative feedback can create a lot of patterns. So in time, for instance, you can get oscillating patterns. This electrical circuit that produces oscillations. This is an action potential, a neural pulse. It's also created by a combination of positive and negative feedback. And you can get all kinds of memory effects. Call this hysteresis. Much of this was first formalized in the 1950s by someone who I think most of you will know, Alan Turing. And he worked with a combination of mathematical equations that basically represent a combination of positive and negative feedback in space. And you can get all kinds of nice patterns. It can be static or it can be moving. You can get all kinds of, well, spots and stripes. as well as spirals that move and waves. And because, well, these processes, these feedback processes are quite general, you see this kind of pattern everywhere in natural systems. For instance, the formation of sand dunes, combination of feedbacks. Tropical cyclones are created by positive feedback mostly. Ice ages are driven by feedbacks. You get, well, oscillations in the climate. And well, the spots and stripes of some organisms are thought to be created by combinations of positive and negative feedback during development. Neural patterns are of course created by feedbacks, as well as well, gene networks. Gene networks are the interactions between genes, basically, and they contain lots of feedback loops. These are a few examples of real parts of networks. The development of plants and animals is thought to be driven by feedback to a large extent. And of course, the ant foraging has a large feedback component, and even the social structure of, well, for instance, monkeys or bee or bumblebee colonies has feedback processes which determine the social hierarchy. Okay, so just as energy provides the thermodynamic driving force behind structure and organization, feedback processes provide one of the main pattern generating mechanisms. In fact, you could consider natural selection itself to be a kind of amplification by positive feedback. And, well, there's also negative feedback, of course. And so these feedback things create a lot of the structure on which evolution can then act. But it's not enough to get multicellular organisms. As Alan Turing himself once said, or is said to have said, regarding a zebra, the stripes are easy, but the horse part is a bit harder to explain. Okay, so the next piece of our puzzle involves relationships between replicators, that is, things that replicate, things that copy themselves. I guess you could call such relationships feed forward instead of feedback, but the term is usually used for other things, so I won't use it. Well, the nature of these dissipative structures, systems, makes that it's quite easy to get food chains. Where was I? Oh yeah. The energy from the sunlight can be degraded along the food chain. Well, this is a classic one where energy is converted into plants, basically. Then the plants are eaten by all kinds of animals that eat other animals, and in the end you have not a lot of the energy left, of the original energy. That's why they have to eat a lot. And at each step about 90% of the energy is lost. So it's a real dissipative system. And actually, well, at the end, the animal at the end is converted back into matter by all kinds of decomposing organisms. And usually these chains are not as simple as this. They're a bit more difficult. This is a simplified version of a oceanic food web. Okay. Well, apart from these kind of eating and being eaten relationships, we also have competitive interactions, for instance. Well, this is also a kind of negative feedback, but you can, for instance, have competition for space, for light, and this is actually the main driver behind natural selection, because, well, the one that does best has the most space, or the most light, or the most food, and then over time it dominates the ones that that don't have that, which means that they cannot exist in equilibrium. The question is if there is equilibrium, of course, but no. There are lots of other relationships. Biologists like to give them all kinds of difficult names like mutualism, commensalism, amensalism, and a few other isms. And these basically include all the ways that one organism can influence another organism, other than for food or for space. And believe it or not, these are actually interesting for a number of reasons. The first reason is that you can see a lot of these relationships in nature between all kinds of things. You can get them between, for instance, molecules that they can have positive or negative influence on each other. You see a lot of these interactions in bacteria, for instance. And you can even get such relationships in communities of digital organisms. A well-known example is the virtual world Terra, which was created in the early 90s by, Thomas Ray, who was a tropical ecologist. And there are some derivatives of this, such as Avida. And, Terra is basically a virtual world, a virtual machine, actually, in which small assembly programs can run and compete for memory. You can see a memory map here, and for CPU cycles. And within a few thousand generations, you can get all kinds of dependence relationships between these programs. For instance, you can get parasites, you can get mutualists, you can get hyperparasites that, are parasites for parasites. And when you turn mutation off, you can even, they sort of even invent a kind of sexual reproduction. So the kind of relationships and processes you see in living systems can also appear in systems that are not actually living, which is interesting. Interesting as well is the simulations that are performed at a group where I study. This is one by Nobuto Takeuchi. And he's trying to simulate the early stages of molecular evolution by basically mutating virtual strings of RNA and then calculating how they fold in 2 dimensions and then letting them interact. And even in such a fairly simple system, you can get all kinds of interactions, well, a few anyway. So he gets sort of a basic ecosystem with 2 species and 2 parasites. And, well, that's where this stripped down version of RNA, an actual RNA molecule has a 3-dimensional structure, so it could do a lot more than these things. Okay, so in evolving systems that offer the possibility of relationship between things that replicate, you can easily get all kinds of interactions and relationships. And each interaction may then create possibilities for new interactions. And they may lead to quite complex networks of interactions, like the food web you saw before. So basically complexity in this case creates more complexity. Okay, so besides being a natural form of complexity, there is another reason why these relationships are interesting, and that is they can help explain some of the increasing, mostly hierarchical complexity you see in replicating systems over time, for instance in organisms. Single cell to multicell organisms, and then multicell organisms getting more complex. And the basic mechanism is that some relationships may prove beneficial. So things, having 2 things does better than having just one. And then it can get selected for. So you basically get a new level of selection. And, they can get combined into a single organization level. I will give a few examples. For instance, a very concrete example is in our own cells. We call these eukaryotic cells. to distinguish them from the simpler prokaryotic cells, which are, for instance, bacteria and also the more primitive forms of life. And they have all kinds of structures inside that perform all kinds of specialist tasks. For instance, there's the cell nucleus that holds the DNA and other genetic material. There's the mitochondrium, which helps helps oxidize all kinds of food molecules. And there's the chloroplasts in plants, which do photosynthesis basically. So they provide energy through converting sunlight. And there is quite a lot of genetic evidence that these structures were all once free-living single-cell organisms. And they were specialized at something, or they became specialized at something, and they started living together with bigger cells. And in the end, they probably, became a new organism. So, although the selection initially acted on separate cells, the reproduction of the collection of all these cells became more important after a while, and it turned into a new level of organization. Well, you can also get these new levels of organization as a result of a bit more unexpected side effects of all kinds of interactions. A nice example is this one. This is a computer model of Maarten Boerlijst and Paulien Hogeweg from 1991. And they basically simulated hypercycles that are cycles of, basically replicators, replicating molecules that can catalyze each other's formation. So you can get a cycle of things that catalyze each other. Well, when you put these in a spatial grid, in this case a cellular automaton grid, you get that they start to catalyze each other and they organize into spirals, so they can easily reach each other. And it then turns out that these spirals, they sort of become dependent on the spirals instead of their own replication speed, because you get selection between spirals. Because these spirals, they start to compete for space. Space is only limited. And who has the biggest spiral becomes the selection criterion, basically. And of course, this still depends on properties of these molecules, but, the spirals have formed a new type of organization and selection. Okay, you might have noticed that the creation of such new levels of organization it will lead to more or less a hierarchical form of organization. So each organization level can be composed of simpler entities, which in turn are formed by even simpler entities, etc. But still all these levels influence each other, and each level adds a bit more complexity and a bit more things that can be modified by evolution. And that's what we see in nature, basically. Molecules that form into cells, and cells that form into all kinds of tissues, and then form into organisms, populations, communities of populations, whatever. And in the end, you have the entire biosphere. Okay, let's return for a moment to these replicating molecules that were around about 4 billion years ago, 4.3 billion years ago. A collection of these replicating molecular systems probably formed the first cells about 3.5 billion years ago. And fairly soon these started to live together in filaments, and in communities and in some more intimate forms of organization, like the eukaryotic cell things. And they merged into, the single eukaryotic cell about 2.5 million years ago. And by 1.8 billion years, these internal the internal complexity within these cells had increased sufficiently to allow for sexual reproduction, which is basically the mixing of genetic material from two cells, so you can get a lot more diversity. And this quite, greatly speeded up evolution. So about 1.4 billion years ago, the first truly multicellular organisms had appeared. These were similar to the sponges we see today. And they consist basically of a few different cell types that all became specialized for doing some task. And not long afterwards, they started to form some bigger structures like this that were capable of ingesting food and sometimes capable of organized movement. And by about 600 million years ago, multicellular life had evolved into all kinds of things. Similar to today's jellyfish or all kinds of worms and sea anemones, for instance, mollusks. And these lived of, smaller single-celled organisms and sometimes of each other. And after a while, you got the so-called Cambrian explosion, in which hard-bodied organisms started to appear. And they were similar to the crabs and insects you see today. By 435 million years ago, you had the first fish, the first land plants appearing. And, not long afterwards, about 100 million years, it's a relatively short period, the fish had crawled upon to the land, and they formed the first amphibians, which then formed reptilians later on, reptiles. And you also had the first land-based insects. About 200 million years ago, these reptiles sort of split into mammals and birds. And the reptiles themselves went on to do quite well until about 65 million years ago, when they got hit by a large meteorite and they all died. And then the mammals took over. Now where was I? Oh yeah. Around 50 million years ago, the first primates appeared. They were small, sort of tree-going organisms. Well, they basically they later evolved into apes and then into the first humans, and then they went on to form social structures. They evolved language, they invented agriculture, cities, writing, and eventually nuclear weapons, global warming, and Windows Vista. Now, what's interesting in all of this is that you can still see some of these evolutionary stages in our development from egg cell to newborn baby. You would almost forget, but even the most complex multicellular organism still starts off as just one cell. And before it gets all the way to being multicellular and complicated, it's quite a long way to go. So basically, part of our evolutionary history is repeated in fast forward during our development, as each developmental stage builds upon the previous stage. And what's this? Builds upon the previous stage and adds more complexity. Of course, we're not actually repeating evolution, because the information for doing this is already stored in the genome of the single cell. And the genome is basically a long string of molecules that holds just under a gigabyte of information, if you just look at the base pairs. So apparently, a complex life form can be compressed into about 1 million bits of pure information and some chemical and physical machinery that translate this information into chemical reactions. That's, well, quite interesting. Unfortunately, we don't really know exactly how this works yet. We do know that, well, at least the properties of the cell are important. The cell is, of course, the basic building block for all multicellular organisms. And the more complex an organism, the more types of cell it tends to have. So each cell is specialized for a certain task, and it's well, the interactions between cells that makes that certain tissues and organs are formed. And these tissues and organs can then be modified just for all kinds of purposes. By evolutionary processes, for instance. We also know that the dynamics of the gene network are very important. The genes themselves code for proteins, and these proteins basically perform the chemical reactions. And these chemical reactions then, well, again, influence, they can influence all kinds of things, but they make that we can get different cell types. And, well, basically these interactions create some, well, it creates a complex network of all kinds of feedback and feed-forward processes, like you can see in the back. And this network can quite easily be modified by simply adding or removing genes and then modifying these interactions or the genes themselves. So it creates a lot more flexibility. It also creates a kind of genetic program in which certain genes can, well, they can amplify other genes, and then that influences some chemical reactions, and then you can get, well, things like this, formation of different cell types. Where was I? Oh yeah. But these interactions between these different cell types, they can also turn on and off the cells, the genes. So there's, well, the levels of the cells and the levels of the genetic system, they influence each other. And that is a kind of local communication between individual cells. There are also more global forms of communication or signaling. And these are provided by all kinds of signaling molecules. For instance, hormones, as we like to call them, are a type of global signal. Now we are actually starting to understand how the elements mentioned here can lead to a bunch of single cells forming a more complex organism with more than one cell type. And it's actually possible to simulate parts of this process. I would like to show you two computer models which do this, or, well, to a certain extent. They are at the level of biological cells, and these cells are based on the so-called cellular pods model. And, well, this model simulates cells as a collection of smaller cells on a 2- or 3-dimensional grid. And these cells follow a set of, well, these larger cells follow a set of physical rules. And well, things like volume conservation, surface energy minimization, deformation under pressure. And in this way they can interact with each other and with the medium they're in. So in many ways these cells behave like real cells. And the nice thing is you can add rules to them. So you can represent, for instance, part of a gene network or a chemical reaction pathway, or simply adding rules to each cell, and then you can see what the interaction between the cells does. So, in this model, by Pauline Hogeweg. She took one of these cell models, and she added a network of binary operators. And that sort of represents a very simple gene network. Things can turn each other on or off. And this network then determines the adhesion between cells. Adhesion is how good the cells stick to each other. So basically this way, the genes influence the interactions between the cells. But also the other way around, of course, because, the interaction between the cells can turn genes on and off by having one or two signaling nodes, which react to other signaling nodes in neighboring cells. And, okay, so if you then start with one cell, you let it divide a few times, and you add a bit of noise, you end up with some multi-cell shape after a while. And because of the different interactions, you get all kinds of different cell types. It's the colors, for instance, you see here. So if you have the starting cell, it divides into 4, and then you let that divide further. Well, in the beginning, it won't do much, but you can let this thing evolve. You can let the network evolve, at least. And if you select for maximum diversity, after a while you end up with all kinds of structures which start from one cell and then divide into structures that are very similar to the things you actually see in natural organisms. And it also turns out that a lot of these evolutionary pathways lead to the same type of structure evolving. So you can see some reinvention of the same shapes. That's also something we see in nature. So, it's really nice. You can get these shapes by only simulating some of the processes that we think are responsible for creating complex organisms. But of course, these shapes really they just divide. They don't do anything else. Because we didn't select for it, we only selected for lots of cell types. It is possible to get a collection of cells like this to perform a function, of course. Now, I think I'm missing a page. No. What I'm going to show you now is a slightly curious creature. It's called the cellular slime mold. And it basically lives most of the time as an amoeba. And it eats bacteria like this. And it's quite happy this way until it starts to run out of food. And then we hope to see, we see that they start to organize themselves into streams. And these streams go toward a single point. And they form sort of a clump of cells there. And then this clump of cells, still forming. It starts to crawl away, basically. So you can see it here. It forms a kind of slug. And it then goes and looks for, basically a nice spot. And there the following happens. It turns into kind of a mushroom. And at the top, it then has spores. And then these spores can get spread, and they turn into amoeba again. So, it's a bit of a strange creature, this, because most of the time it's a single cell organism, and then part of the time it's a multi-cell organism. And turns out we can actually simulate this, this organism, at least part of it. So here we have a model, another model, and it's created by Stan Marais, who's also at our group, and Pauline Hogeweg and Nick Saville. And it's again based on the cellular pods model, but this time without a gene network. And instead, only a few basic chemical reactions are simulated by a set of equations in the cell. And this mostly involves this molecule here, which is known as cyclic AMP, and it's well used for lots of things. But well, in this organism, it functions as a sort of a global signal molecule. And the reaction you see here is, well, it's mostly a feedback thing. And it reacts to, well, it produces cyclic AMP when it encounters cyclic AMP. So you can get all kinds of interesting things. And this reaction is influenced by temperature and by light, for instance. So this is a way for it to interact with the environment. And it turns out, if I start the simulation, well, that the amoeba start to excrete this substance when they can't find enough food. And then they go towards this substance and they form this mound, and it then crawls away, as you can see also in the simulation. And this crawling is actually caused by waves of this molecule, which go from the front to the back through the slug, and they create kind of pressure waves. You can also see there are three different cell types, and they are slowly being sorted as the organism moves. In a minute we should be able to see the pressure waves. Okay, this is an example of light influencing the organism. Well, yeah, these same pressure waves cause some cells to be pushed down, and then the other thing to be pushed up, because action is minus reaction. And then in the end you only have these cells left, and they turn into spores. Here are the pressure waves again, and you can see it pushing down the other cells. So this is actually a three-dimensional simulation for the most part. Bits of it are in 2D, but well, the graphics are not that impressive. But I was still quite impressed when I saw this for the first time. Five minutes, okay. I'm almost finished, so that's good. Okay. This model nicely shows that cooperation between cells and, well, quite complex behavior. This is quite complex, having a thing crawl away and then forming into another thing. It can quite easily emerge from just a few basic physical and chemical processes. And for the rest, the interactions between the cells. And this is at multiple organization levels. You have the chemical reactions, you have the cells, you have the clumps of cells. And it also shows the importance of computer simulations for understanding these kinds of processes. Because it's not enough to just study, for instance, just the cells or just the chemical reactions, because that still doesn't tell you how the organism works. Because most of the behavior is generated by the interactions and not by the parts themselves. And it's nice that in the computer you can just take a number of these processes and interactions and then simulate it and see what happens. Unfortunately, most biologists are not very good programmers, so simulations of this type are not very common. Also, people and scientists in particular, they don't really like complexity. They like to take things apart and see how it works, and then create nice, clean mathematical expressions for it. But yeah, it explains quite a lot, but not these kind of messy living behaviors. Well, a lot of time in biology and also in other fields, like artificial life and things, people talk about survival of the fittest. But the problem is, what is the fittest? Is it the one that grows fastest? Or it can also, usually, it's also the one that doesn't die first, when the environment becomes a bit different. And the environment becomes different all the time because it's also created by the organisms around you. So basically, real organisms are in local optima most of the time. And that's also the reason why real organisms get not only selected for growth, but also for diversity and for robustness against change. Well, this is called a fitness landscape. You see them a lot in evolutionary theory. But actual fitness landscapes are more like fitness seascapes. They change all the time, and the change is also dependent on interactions. So, well, evolution has to work with what's available. So it never gets to the global optimum, which is just as well, because well, an optimal world would be a little bit boring, I think. You would have only one species, would be good at everything, and would be very bored because sex wouldn't exist, because that would be a waste of energy. Luckily, we don't live in an optimal world. We live in a messy world and a complex world. And, well, evolution is basically driven by accumulating levels of complexity and of organization and of information. And, well, this complexity creates then further complexity because every new development creates lots of possibilities for other developments. And this positive feedback loop of invention, it makes that evolution is actually speeding up. It took over, well, you can see, over 2 billion years to get the first modern biological cells, and only about half a billion years to get multicellular organisms, and then well, animals, land plants, etc. evolved within about 500 million years. And of course, well, the same goes for society. It took us a long time to get from apes to invent language, and then we formed more complicated social structures, invented agriculture, invented writing, and then things sort of started exploding because of the accumulated knowledge. So it's basically the same process. And it's all driven, of course, by a steady supply of energy. And we don't know where it ends, basically. As you've seen what the introduction of computers has done. It's greatly increased storage and communication. So it's another level in the evolutionary story. I do know that it's important to gain a better understanding of these, especially the things I told you about, the role of energy, feedback mechanisms, self-replication, and the levels of organization and the interactions between them. And these occur not only, because these processes occur not only in living systems, Well, it's interesting to see that you get the same kind of patterns in all kinds of systems. For instance, economic systems and social systems all show complex networks of things that interact, and they all show the same kind of behavior. So I would say it's time we started looking a bit more at the interactions. I started looking a bit more at, well, trying to simulate things. And I hope I've been able to show that to you. And I thank you for your attention. Other questions?
We maybe have time for just a few quick questions, but we do need to prepare the room for the next talk. So if anybody has any questions? Okay then.